All right, let's give this a shot again. See if the quality is better. Okay, this looks better. All right. Okay, cool. I believe we are live then and recording. Okay, cool. Last time I tried recording this, the quality of video was just terrible. So I restarted and it's much better now. So I hope you guys are having a great day. So great Thursday as I'm recording this. So I wanted to pop on here and talk about the new dietary guidelines for Americans because I know this is super popular right now. Obviously, they just got released yesterday. Ton of content on social media from everybody, reviewing that and everyone giving their thoughts. So wanted to come on here and share my thoughts regarding the new guidelines and would love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments if you are watching this in the Facebook group live too. So just some like background information, right? The dietary guidelines, why they're even relevant and why they even matter is they do help to influence the American public of how they should maybe balance their plate, how they should maybe eat, what kind of foods to maybe limit in their diet, maybe to include a little bit more in their diet. So it gives us a framework of what is the government or what, are we as a country stating are quote unquote healthy foods and what are foods to maybe, limit. So that's why, they're obviously important. Who are these guidelines for? So I think this is really important to keep in mind and remember too, that these guidelines, any guidelines that you see get put out there from the government as like policy or, for the general public, like these are not for specific people. There are parts of these guidelines that might not necessarily apply to you. Like for me personally, if I were to follow these guidelines to a T, I probably would not be fueling myself with enough carbohydrates, and we'll get into that in a second, for all of the workouts and the lifting that I do. If a marathon runner or a half marathon runner, somebody who does a lot of cardio, if they were going to follow these guidelines to a T, they would probably be under eating carbs and would not do really well with their performance in those races. Olympic athletes or runners or professional athletes, if they followed these guidelines to a T, they would probably not be getting, all the nutrients they need because they would be a little bit more restricted. So keep in mind that these guidelines, whenever they put this kind of stuff out, it is in the context of over 70% of Americans are either overweight and obese, and over however many percentage of Americans don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, don't eat enough whole foods, eat too many processed foods, too many calories in general. So a lot of these guidelines are geared towards, okay, how can we incorporate more whole foods and also decrease the calorie intake of mostly everybody, but some of you who are at maybe a healthy body weight and exercise a ton, exercise regularly, might not have to actually decrease calories. So keep that in mind that like these recommendations are for just the average general person, but not every specific part of them might apply to you. Now, the previous guidelines that we had before. One thing that's been like really big with this whole big announcement is, okay, we're taking the old food pyramid, flipping it upside down on its head, and now we have this new pyramid. And it's being talked about from the perspective of the old pyramid has still been around, where the old pyramid has not been used for nearly over 20 years, I believe. Like 2011 was when they got rid of a pyramid in general. Like we haven't had an actual food pyramid since 2011. And when I went to college, when I went to grad school for nutrition and got my master's in nutrition and became a registered dietitian, went through my dietetic internship, we didn't even use a food pyramid at all. So I think some of I don't know if you would call it marketing or the media has kind of taken this and be like, oh, well, the old food pyramid was trash and now we're changing that. But like we've discontinued using the food pyramid for years. Now people still remember it from grade school, but as far as like government and policy, like we haven't used that and dietitians haven't learned that in so long. So what actually was relevant up until, yesterday was the MyPlate guideline. So a visual image showing you how to put your plate together. And if you like go into the website deeper, there's certain recommendations of how many servings of this and that, which I'll get into. But we haven't used the pyramid in a while. So it's kind of disingenuous for like just the media or anybody to be like popularizing the idea of, oh, we had this really crappy food pyramid up until now, and now we have this really good food pyramid, when really we haven't used that old food pyramid in so long. So I'm going to try to share my screen a little bit too with this. to just show you guys some images and everything. So first, let's go over like the initial visual changes of the new dietary guidelines. So when you go to the website, what you see. So yeah, let's go over the visual changes. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And it's actually my first time sharing my screen on this specific platform. So hopefully I get it right. And if you are listening on podcast form later on, I'm going to try to describe this as much as possible. So let me see. All right. So should be sharing my screen here. So here is an image of just like the front facing image you see when you look at the new dietary guidelines. So what we have here are, sorry, I'm trying to jumble around a bunch of windows. So you see this reverse pyramid, got a bunch of protein, dairy, fats over in this top left corner, have a bunch of fruits and vegetables in the top right corner. On the bottom, you see a little bit more fruits, see some nuts and seeds here, and then at the bottom you see like whole grains. So from first glance, first initial reaction to this, here are some things that I maybe don't like about this. So one thing that I don't like is that it doesn't show how an actual plate should look. And that is one of the big benefit of the like old MyPlate visual that we had before, which I'll actually go ahead and share now so you can see like the differences here. Maybe I should just go ahead and share my whole screen, to be honest. But let's maybe we should just do that. Share the whole screen so you can kind of see both. So you should see the whole screen here. Wow, this is jumbled up. All right. So the old image, the MyPlate, this is what it shows here. And then you'll see on the left side, the new image. So one thing that I kind of don't like is that there is no like visual representation of what your plate should look like in these new guidelines. I think it would have been really helpful for them to like maybe have this new pyramid here, but then also somewhere down below have a visual kind of like it is here of what this looks like as far as your plate, right? So like when you're putting your plate in front of you, half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables, a quarter of it some kind of lean protein, a quarter of it grains, and then maybe some kind of dairy on the side. Like that's a really good visual representation, and a lot of dietitians who like work with different populations that maybe speak different languages, this is really helpful because it's a very clear picture of how you can put and structure your plate together. And it would have been really easy for them to like include this in the guidelines, the new ones, just an image like this, on top of like this kind of pyramid image. Because if you see this pyramid image, you might like look at these food items and be like, okay, well, I'm going to choose food items from this pyramid. Like, for breakfast, I'm going to have a bunch of protein, but maybe not necessarily fruits and vegetables for breakfast because you don't actually see what your actual plate should look like per meal, if that makes sense. So I kind of don't really like that you can't really see like what your plate should visually look like. Other thing I don't really like about these guidelines, kind of mentioned before, is that they're comparing this old pyramid or this new pyramid to the old pyramid. And that's a big kind of marketing thing they're using, where the old pyramid hasn't been used in so long, and is really outdated. So this idea that like we've been taught the wrong guidelines and that's why so many Americans are overweight and obese, and now here it's this new pyramid, like it's not true because we haven't used that old pyramid in so long. A couple of other things I don't really like about this new image is just a couple of the food items on this image I don't really like. Not a big fan of having whole milk on here. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but having all of your protein sources be like full fat versions or high fat versions isn't the best idea in my opinion, because a lot of those fats are saturated fats, and saturated fats, high levels of them can cause a higher risk of heart disease, higher risk of high LDL cholesterol, and so on. And also the calories and full fat options for like dairy and meats and everything tend to be a lot higher than like the leaner versions. So when Americans, when we're so overweight and obese, that comes down to us overeating calories. So if we can have lower fat versions of those foods, but still get the protein that we need, that's going to help us to keep those calories a little bit lower, which is going to overall help with weight loss, fat loss. So I'm not really a big fan of seeing the whole milk. I can kind of live with the whole milk, but one other thing that I kind of really didn't like about this image was the butter. Butter is just pure saturated fat. There aren't any health benefits to butter, especially if you are having like higher fat versions of meats and protein and stuff here there. Like you don't need to be adding butter to your diet. It's not really a good choice health wise. So I'm not a big fan of them including the butter in the image here too. Like if they would just scrap the butter and have just like even this carton of milk just say milk, it would make this versus whole milk. It would make this image just so much better in my opinion. There. Another thing I didn't really like is that they kind of de-emphasize healthy whole grain carbs, which is a really great source of fiber for a lot of people. Yes, we get fiber from fruits and vegetables, and fiber, by the way, is a kind of subcategory of carbohydrate that really helps digestion, helps with regular bowel movements, helps prevent colon cancer, helps us to feel full. So many health benefits of fiber, and most Americans don't get nearly enough fiber. And it is really hard to get enough fiber from just fruits and vegetables. You can get a good amount for sure, but a lot of times you need those whole grains to get more fiber. So I would like to see like maybe a slightly bigger, tiny bit bigger portion of whole grains, like maybe bring this little category up just like one little row and include especially things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, great sources of fiber, great sources of vitamin A, great sources of potassium. So I'd really like to see them include just a little bit more of those healthy carbohydrates inside of there. So those are kind of the things I don't like about the initial front facing image here. So things that I do like, right? And I'll admit there are some things I do like about this image. I like that you can get an idea of specific foods to choose, right? Like with the just MyPlate image here, like they have the categories, right? The fruits, the vegetables, the grains, the protein, the dairy. But for somebody who isn't really sure what a grain is or isn't really sure what a protein is, it is nice to kind of see this visual here. So I do like that a part of this image. I do like that there is a big emphasis on fruits and vegetables with this image too. Like I think that's good to see. Oh, looking at this, you can see some apples in there, bananas, grapes, carrots, broccoli. I do really like that too. Another thing that I actually really like about this image is they do include frozen peas, it looks like here, and then also canned green beans. Frozen vegetables and canned vegetables have gotten kind of a bad rap for no reason. They are very healthy for us. And they're great ways to buy vegetables because they don't go bad. How many times have you bought vegetables, put them in your fridge, haven't eaten them for a week for whatever reason? Now they go old and now you're throwing them away and wasting money. Whereas canned vegetables, frozen vegetables can last so long. And a lot of times, too, frozen and canned vegetables actually have a better nutrient profile than fresh ones because as the fresh vegetables get old, their nutrient and vitamin and mineral composition can change, and actually you could lose a little bit of nutrients. But because they're frozen or canned, those variations, they actually like can them and freeze them when the nutrient profile is basically at its peak. And then because they're frozen and canned, it actually keeps that until you cook them. So I like that they included frozen and canned vegetables in this image. So people kind of get the initial reaction, oh, those are healthy to choose. Now, if you're somebody who, like, let's say specifically because of high blood pressure for whatever reason, you do have to limit sodium, you want to be mindful of that with some canned vegetables and get like low sodium versions probably of those. But I do like that. Now, also too, just a little note I wanted to make too, like visually, it's actually not that much different than the MyPlate version when we think of the proportions of some of these foods. I think the whole grain proportion of this image here is a little bit small, but other than that, it's actually pretty similar because when you look at this MyPlate image, like you have protein and dairy that make up a really high portion of this overall like puzzle piece here that you see, which makes up probably, if you add all this up, probably like 40% of your plate. And you have fruits and vegetables that probably make about 40% of your plate up here. And then grains probably makes up about 20%. Now it looks like grains make up 25%. It looks like it makes up a quarter of your plate. But remember, we have dairy here, so we have to kind of factor that in. Where this pyramid, if you look at the category of fruits and vegetables, you look at the category of the protein and dairy, and then look at the grains, it's actually kind of similar to where grains probably makes up 20% roughly of this pyramid. Protein and dairy makes up roughly 40%, and then fruits and vegetables make up roughly 40%. So it's actually pretty similar when you look at the proportions. But like I said, I would like to see like a plate version of this so somebody could visually see how to put those together. So visually, those are kind of the changes there. Those are kind of my likes and dislikes with it. Now, the messaging behind, let me go ahead and stop my share. The messaging behind all of these changes. So, big message that you probably saw, on the big screen when you looked at the website was eat real food. And I do overall like this message. I do think it's a good message to have and put out to people because overall, like we eat so many processed foods. Most Americans do. And processed foods tend to be higher in calorie. They tend to be much tastier. So they're really easy to overeat. They tend to be really like soft, either soft or crunchy, which has a very desirable like mouthfeel and texture psychologically to make us want to overeat too. So I do really like the overall message of quote unquote eat real food. I think there's nuances to where like, okay, there are some processed foods that are perfectly fine to eat and can be health promoting. So it's not a blanket statement to like religiously live by, but I think overall it's a decent slogan and it gets the point across that, okay, we want to eat a little bit more whole foods and less ultra processed foods. But these are also messages that have been around for years too. Like even with the old guidelines from 2020, they promote eating mostly whole foods, not a lot of processed food. So it's not new. It's always been pushed, but it's like the coined term or phrase for these guidelines. So it seems like it's being pushed a little bit more. Like I think there's this idea that processed foods have been pushed by, our government guidelines for years. And now we're going against that when really like we've always been encouraged to not eat a lot of processed food. But I can't be mad at that phrase or slogan for sure. With the message too, one thing I don't really like about the messaging is some of the messaging when you like kind of look through the documents and everything, and then even that image, like I said, with the full fat dairy, the whole milk, is that it does emphasize and encourage full fat dairy, butter, and I think other saturated fats too much with just like some of the meat sources and just this idea of, okay, like carbs are bad, fatty meats are good, and fruits and vegetables are good. Like fruits and vegetables are good. Meats for sure are good. You probably want to choose lower fat versions. And carbs are perfectly fine if you're eating the right amounts for you and you're choosing mostly high fiber whole grain carbs. So I'm not a big fan of just the push for like butter and whole fat dairy all the time and not being conscious of the saturated fat you're getting from meat because like the general population can't discern, okay, necessarily what's a processed meat that's high in fat versus what's a more whole food meat that's high in fat that might be a little bit healthier. So, for example, having like a steak that has some fat in it, that's perfectly fine, balancing that out with fruits and vegetables and, some healthy carbs. But the general population, they're going to kind of see that there's not a whole lot of not red flags, but little warnings of, okay, be mindful of your fat intake coming from meat. And they're going to think possibly things like sausages, bacon, more processed meats that are really high in fat and calories are quote unquote healthy because it's protein and it's meat. But really, those types of things aren't really that high in protein and are just high in a lot of processed saturated fats that along with, a high calorie intake can lead to, obesity, obviously, but also, cardiovascular disease. So I think I'm not a big fan of the push of like whole fat dairy. I think choosing low fat dairy is probably the best option for most of the time, and especially choosing leaner cuts of meat. Like, if you get a steak, get a sirloin instead of a really fatty steak most of the time. Avoid the high fat meats like sausages and brats and bacon and that. I think that would be a good message to include in there as like a disclaimer of yes, we want higher protein. Protein is great for us, and the previous recommendations have been a little bit low in protein, but be mindful of the fat intake you're getting from the protein. From the saturated fat, like I said, that can lead to heart disease, but also the extra calories you're getting from that. The overall message does emphasize fruits and vegetables a lot, like the previous recommendations did too, which, I'm glad that they didn't change that and they kept that. And then these messages also emphasize more protein, which I do think is a good thing. Like I said, the protein recommendations have been pretty low for a long time. The RDA has always been 0.8 grams per kilogram, which is really on the low end. And the recommendations now with these new guidelines go up to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day, which aligns a lot more with the research of what's good for overall health, what's good for muscle mass, muscle maintenance. Like 0.8 grams per day was always the number to like the minimum amount to prevent deficiencies, but it wasn't necessarily the optimum amount for overall health, longevity, muscle mass, and so on. So I like that they increased that to 1.2 to 1.6. I really like this. But also a little bit of a caution with these numbers and I wish they would kind of change the wording around this, is that if you have a lot of weight to lose, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day might be a little bit too high or a little bit higher than what you actually need. If you are, let's say, 300 pounds and you need to lose over 100 pounds to be at like a healthy body weight for your frame, if you use 1.6 grams per kilogram for protein, it's going to have you probably eating, I don't know, over 200 grams of protein, maybe even close to 250 grams of protein, which is pretty excessive for somebody who is 300 pounds, but their healthy weight is actually maybe 170 or 180 or something. So I think a better recommendation, and this is what I use with my clients and I give them a protein goal, is I use roughly what their normal weight would be by BMI standards. And it's not to say that you have to be that weight to be healthy. Like I'm not using BMI as necessarily an end all be all of, okay, the BMI scale, you need to be inside that normal weight category to be healthy. But that's a good gauge to use what that body weight would be for this protein recommendation, because it's going to be more reflective of how much actual muscle mass or lean mass you have on your frame or can sustain naturally, which is going to be more reflective of how much protein you need. So if I was 300 pounds, but by BMI standards, let's say the high end of a normal BMI for my height is maybe 170 pounds, I would use 170 pounds for this grams per kilogram recommendation, not 300. Keep that in mind, that if you have a lot of weight to lose, use what your like ideal body weight would be, or what a healthy body weight would be for you roughly, not your current weight if you have a lot of weight to lose. Other like specifics and differences and changes in these guidelines versus the ones 5 years ago from 2020. If you look at the actual wording and open up the PDF and read through it, which I did, it includes, okay, we want to have healthy fats, things like olive oil, but it also states butter and beef tallow as alternatives that you can use instead. And like, it's really clear through the research that saturated fat, high levels of it, especially with a high calorie diet, which a lot of Americans consume, can cause high LDL cholesterol, which then can cause heart disease. So I don't like that they're including butter and beef tallow in there, because those are very high in saturated fat. If they were to just leave it at olive oil, I'd be happy with that. Like olive oil is a really healthy fat to include. But even then, we do even want to limit olive oil because it's really easy to overeat in calories. And the biggest reason why we're overweight and obese, or actually the only reason is essentially is we're overall eating too many calories. And then also in these guidelines, which kind of contradicts each other a little bit, the messaging is they keep the saturated fat intake recommendation to 10% of our total calories, which is what the previous recommendation was to keep your saturated fat intake to 10% or less of our total calories. And that recommendation has stayed. But with the images and with some of this wording of suggesting butter and beef tallow as an alternative to olive oil, it would be really hard probably to follow that kind of messaging with the images and then what they're stating with the butter and beef tallow and the whole milk instead of low fat dairy. It would be hard to do that while also keeping your saturated fat to 10% less of your calories. So those kind of things kind of contradict each other, which I don't like, which is why I said, you probably should kind of encourage lower fat dairy and lower fat meats, less butter, more olive oil if you are going to cook with something. That way, you can get all the benefits of the protein from having the leaner meats and the low fat dairy, but also you're keeping your saturated fat below 10%, like the recommendation is here. So I do like the emphasis on the protein, but I think we should emphasize lean protein to keep saturated fat and overall calorie intake lower too, because, one of the biggest sources of calories that I see when I look at like clients' food logs, when a client comes on, is either one, they're eating too many like sweets, processed foods, prepackaged foods, potato chips, things like that, or the meats they're eating are just too high in fat. Like they're buying ground beef because they think ground beef is healthy, high in protein, but they're buying the like 73% lean ground beef or the 80% lean ground beef. And those ground beefs can be like 80% lean ground beef could be like 300 calories per every 4 ounce and have just as much fat as protein in them. And it's saturated fat too. But 4 ounces of 96 for lean ground beef or 93.7 lean ground beef, so 93% lean or 96% lean, those are less than 200 calories per every 4 ounce. So you're saving 100 calories at least from getting the 96 or 93% versus the 80%. And then also the fat intake is much lower. So the saturated fat intake is much lower. So it's going to allow you to stay within that saturated fat guideline of being below 10% of your total calories easier if you choose the leaner meats. So big portion, like I said, of the high calorie foods that a lot of clients eat that I look at are like the treats, the sweets, the sugar stuff, the cookies, all that. But the second biggest is probably clients thinking they're choosing healthy sources of protein, but they're choosing such high fat sources of protein that they're way higher in calories than what they need to. And you could drastically cut 300, 400, 500 calories out of your diet for the day by choosing leaner versions of those meats, leaner versions of the dairy, leaner versions of the cheese and all that. So I would have loved to see that, the emphasis of protein, but also the emphasis of choosing leaner sources of protein and lower fat sources of dairy. Another thing, as far as their messaging when you read through, is they do discourage the use of artificial sweeteners, which I don't like either. There's a ton of evidence regarding them that they are perfectly safe, especially in the amounts that a normal human would consume. Like you would have to consume 100 times that the amount that's like regarding as safe that you would actually consume in a day from a human. You would have to consume 100 times that amount to even meet the threshold of what could cause any damage. And even that statistically is like reduced by 10 times. So you would actually have to eat or drink 1,000 times the amount that is regarded as safe to actually see negative side effects that like persist over a long period of time, on average in the research. And artificial sweeteners can be really beneficial for people who are trying to replace regular Coke with Diet Coke, or somebody who puts sugar in their coffee and they're having 200 calories worth of regular sugar every morning. Replacing that with a little bit of artificial sweetener that's 0 calories is a really great way to save 200 calories every day. On top of the Coke, they're saving another 150 to 200 calories throughout their day. So artificial sweeteners can be a really great tool because they are 0 calories for satisfying a sweet craving while not having the calories that come along with it. And like I said, the majority of the research really does not show that they are harmful in the moderate amounts that a human would consume. If you're consuming 20 Diet Cokes a day, like maybe you're going to have some digestion issues for sure. Just a lot of bloating and everything. But like one a day, such a small amount that you're getting. And that one a day Coke can be enough to help somebody bring their calories down, satisfy that sweet craving, lose a lot of weight over time. So I don't like that. Another part of this messaging is that's different from the old messaging is the old messaging would recommend grains. 50% of them come from whole grains, things that are high in fiber, oats, potatoes, whole wheat bread. 50% of those would be recommended to come from whole grains. And then 50% were okay from the other guidelines to be refined grains. So maybe like white rice or white bread, something more refined where the grains and the fiber have been kind of stripped out of it. But the new guidelines kind of discourages refined grains altogether and basically just recommends whole grains 100%, which, I'm not really against that. Whole grains, super beneficial. Are people still going to eat some refined grains in their diet? For sure. Whether you say they're okay, 50% or not, people are going to do it. So I'm not mad with the overemphasis on whole grains for sure. I think that's a good thing overall. There is a reduced recommendation of grains in general from 6 servings per day for like someone who's eating 2,000 calories from the previous guidelines 5 years ago. And now it ranges from 2 to 4. So they've kind of cut the grain recommendation in half from 6 to 2 to 4. And like I said, for somebody who exercises a lot and they're really active, like that might not necessarily be relevant to you. So keep in mind that these are for the general population who probably needs to lose weight, who probably needs to cut their calories down, who probably is over consuming these things. That's what, these guidelines are kind of for. So that's one change regarding those like servings per day recommendation. The vegetable recommendation basically stayed the same. For somebody eating 2,000 calories per day, it went from 2.5 servings to 3 servings. So it went up by half a serving, but essentially the same. The protein recommendation did go up quite a bit. So the protein recommendation for 2,000 calories was 5.5 servings per day. From the 2020 guidelines, and the 2025 guidelines are now, or 2026, whatever year they're calling it, is 9 to 12. So it's basically doubled the protein recommendation, which kind of reflects the gram per kilogram recommendation, basically doubling too. And then the fruit and fats coming from oils recommendation basically stayed the same. So really not a ton of differences of like the more specific numbers that they're saying with the servings per day you should have if you're eating 2,000 calories. The only difference is protein's basically doubled and the grains have basically been cut in half. That's kind of it as far as the specifics there. So in summary, these guidelines have a higher emphasis on protein, which I like. They have a bigger reminder about real food. Can be a little bit oversimplified, that real food term, right? But I do overall like, I would say, the messaging there. It does discourage added sugars and refined grains a lot, which overall, like I said, I kind of like just discouraging those a little bit more, knowing people are going to still include them in your diet. But if you discourage them a little bit more, maybe they'll bring down their intake, a little bit at baseline. I wish it would promote more low-fat meats and low-fat dairy and not encourage butter or beef tallow. So that's something that I don't like. I wish it had a little bit more promotion of high-fiber carbs, especially things like potatoes that are super beneficial with potassium and fiber. I don't like that it discourages artificial or zero-calorie sweeteners because they're totally fine in moderation to have, and they can be really helpful for weight loss and managing cravings for sure. And then the visual of foods, I like overall that they have specific examples of foods in their image, but I wish they would include, like I said, a separate image of a plate of what that would look like, and then get rid of the butter from the image. You don't need to have that in the pyramid there. So it overall has some good messages and some not so great messages. And like I said, if they would encourage lower fat meats and dairy and didn't encourage butter and they didn't discourage zero calorie sweeteners, sure, I could nitpick like little minor things that I maybe don't agree with, but overall, I think it would have very little problems with it, to be honest. But I think the probably biggest discrepancy is like pushing the butter a little bit too much, pushing the full fat meat and dairy options too much, while also having the saturated fat recommendation still low. For heart disease prevention, I think that kind of contradicts each other. So those are my thoughts initially on, the guidelines and everything. I think people who hate these new guidelines are probably too far in this direction. And I think people who are just unbelievably in love with these recommendations are probably too far in that direction and don't understand that like the guidelines haven't changed too much compared to where they were 5 years ago, just minor changes. But overall, like, will these guidelines even make a difference? That's the big question. And not to be pessimistic, but probably not. Like, nobody followed the previous recommendations anyway from 5 years ago. Nobody followed them even from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Even if people actually followed like the original food guide pyramid, we wouldn't be as overweight and obese as we are now. And especially like the physical activity guidelines, if people would follow those, we wouldn't either. I do hope that because there is an emphasis on higher protein, that people will emphasize that, and maybe a bigger emphasis on fruits and vegetables when you initially look at the image. Hopefully people will focus on that. But I also hope that people won't disregard the amount of saturated fat in some of these animal products and the amount of calories that come along with those saturated fats from animal products, because what people will do is if you show them a list of foods that can be included in a healthy diet, they will pick out all the foods that they think fit the category and that they like and be like, okay, well, I'm going to eat all those foods and maybe disregard the foods that I don't like from it. And they might think, like I said, sausage and bacon kind of fall in this high protein category. And even though it has high saturated fat, like that's okay because butter is recommended, when really like they're going to eat bacon and high fat foods for breakfast, but have no fruits and vegetables because they don't like them, because most people don't. They're going to have really high fat meats for lunch, along with, I'll have, a couple of cookies because I, didn't eat any cookies for breakfast or something. And now they're getting a bunch of calories along with a bunch of saturated fat because they weren't encouraged to keep their fat intake lower. And now they're overeating on calories and saturated fat, which that is a really bad combo. So if somebody's going to eat maybe higher fat meats, full fat like eggs and steak, and very minimally processed meats that happen to be high in fat, while also eating a ton of fruits and vegetables, they can be perfectly healthy if they're within their calorie means. But the average American isn't going to do that. The average American is going to say, oh, I don't like fruits and vegetables, I'm not going to eat much of those. But this image shows, a bunch of meat and steak and everything. So I'm going to eat some really high fat, high calorie meats and disregard the vegetables, and then still include processed food in their diet, because like, who's going to cut out all processed food from their diet? Probably nobody. And now, like I said, they have this really bad storm of their fat intake is really high and their calories are really high along with it. And then their health really isn't getting better. So I would love to see a lot of changes in people's diets come from this, but people haven't followed the guidelines in years. So are we really going to start following them now? Maybe, but no, probably not. Right. So also remember too, overall calories are king. So you could have a diet that's really not that quote unquote healthy or textbook, but if you are eating the appropriate amount of calories for your body, you will be probably healthier overall than somebody who's eating a lot of really healthy foods, but has 50 or 60 pounds of extra body fat to lose. That's just how the body works. Like carrying around the extra body fat for your frame is usually what causes most of the health issues that we see. So make sure that whatever decisions you make, that, if you're, whether you are going to have whole fat milk or low fat milk, you make sure you incorporate it within a diet that includes the appropriate amount of calories for you to where you aren't eating too many calories and gaining weight over time. So those are my initial thoughts. Hopefully this was helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you are watching this on Facebook. Would love to hear those. And let me know if there's anything I missed too. Any points that you saw when looking at the guidelines that maybe I didn't address. So hopefully you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you guys in the next one.